Tonight's lecture is supported by the Robert B. Church Memorial Lecture Fund. I usually like to say a word of thanks to the faculty committee who organizes these things. I'm the chair of the committee. Also, it also includes Jennifer Aikman, Gail Fulton, Diane Fox, and Matt Rausch, and all the various staff who coordinate this stuff, because it's a lot of logistics in the background that doesn't really show up. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Jessica Rosenkrantz. Jessica is a Boston-based artist, designer, and programmer, and co-founder, along with her partner, Jesse Louis Rosenberg, of Nervous System, a generative design studio that works at the intersection of science, art, and technology. I know many of you too, have admired Jessica and Jesse's work for a long time, and we're really glad to finally have her here to lecture for this evening. If you're looking for someone to follow on Instagram, they're really great. So I would do that if I were you. Jessica and Nervous System create software as much as hardware. They design processes and systems more than forms. They find complex systems of formation and organization in natural phenomena, and then they develop and train algorithms and computer programs to perform in the same way. They use generative processes in which there's no definitive final product per se, but a range of possible outcomes. Their outputs, the outputs of their effort range from jewelry and clothing to art and housewares to objects and toys. They fearlessly cross disciplinary bounds, allying with biology, material and computer sciences, engineering, and manufacturing, among many others. The work of Nervous System has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, Wired, Metropolis, Fast Company, among many others, and exhibited in the Museum of Modern Art, the Cooper Hewitt, the Smithsonian Design Museum, and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. For me, Nervous System is one of the most vibrant and creative outfits in the world of computation and design that we have available. Their constant exploration of natural systems and possibilities is matched only by their commitment to rich and varied computation and design outputs. They're creative formally and aesthetically, at the same time that they're creative technically and materially. And I think that's a rare combination that makes them such an important studio in the future of the design disciplines. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jessica Rosenkrantz.
Does my microphone work? I have it turned on. Sweet. Are we turning off the lights? Or are we leaving them? You prepped me for the lights being turned off. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming to listen to me talk tonight. As you just heard in that extremely flattering introduction, my name is Jessica, and I run a design studio called Nervous System. I started my studio back in 2007 when I was studying in architecture grad school at the GSD at Harvard. And my partner was an undergrad at MIT. And what we sort of wanted to do in our studio was create a place where it was okay to combine techniques from what I was studying, biology and architecture, and what my partner was studying, math and computer science, which we didn't really find a way to do in college. And our studio has just been a sort of place to mash up techniques from these different disciplines. As you heard, we work in many different materials, and we make a myriad of different products, ranging from jigsaw puzzles, lighting, jewelry, furniture, sometimes things even up to the scale of architecture. We're collaborating with biologists, and we work in many different materials, like traditional woodworking, 3D printed ceramics, metalworking, many other things as well. But what sort of unites our body of work isn't the products we make or the materials we work with, but instead our generative design process. So really what we like to say is that our medium is computation, and more specifically using computation to adapt processes and patterns from nature into design tools. Our projects often start from a natural phenomena. Our project Hyphae, which is from 2010, was inspired by how veins form in leaves. We started by looking at scientific research into how this process can be modeled computationally. And then we translated that research into an algorithmic system that allows us to explore this pattern space and develop new types of structures not seen in nature. Our intention in studying natural patterns is not to directly copy or mimic their forms, but to really understand and adapt the logic behind them into design tools that we can use more broadly. Although leaf veination is really a sort of two-dimensional process, we started thinking about what are the three-dimensional implications of that algorithm might be, and ended up creating this design system that we use to create a series of lamps called the hyphae lamps from 2011. Sort of like leaves on a tree, every single product that we make in our studio is different. So for every lamp, we generate a new form and we 3D print a different structure. In order to produce designs like these, we can't just call up a factory in China and ask them to injection mold some plastic. Every single one is different, so we need to work with manufacturing techniques that allow for that type of one-of-a-kindness. Computer-controlled manufacturing, like 3D printing, laser cutting, robot manufacturing, water jet, whatever floats your boat these days, open up all sorts of new possibilities for how we make stuff. They enable us to make incredibly complex objects like these lamps quite easily. They make it possible to create one-of-a-kind designs affordably, and they're also increasingly accessible. So they're starting to be in people's offices, homes, libraries, sort of putting complex manufacturing in the hands of more people than ever before. However, this is sort of all a bit more of a dream than a reality. We have these machines all over the place, but how do you tell them what you want them to make? How do you design the forms that they need to fabricate? So part of the problem behind this that we see at my studio is design software. Design software is very difficult to use. It's expensive, and most of it was sort of designed in a period before we had this sort of manufacturing, so it's more aimed towards older forms of manufacturing that didn't allow for this sort of complexity or uniqueness. So part of what we do at Nervous System is explore creating new types of playful design experiences that try to leverage simulation and web technologies to make it possible for anyone to create. One example of this is this application you can play with on my website called Cell Cycle that we created in 2010, which is sort of an interactive physics simulation that allows you to sculpt and form cellular objects sort of just in real time playfully in the browser. These pieces can then be ordered directly by people off of our site, and we'll 3D print them for you in many different materials. Our design systems are very frequently inspired by the complex dynamic processes that we see in nature. These processes are systems that grow and adapt to different conditions, and the resultant shapes that we get are expressions of the processes and underlying conditions that generated them. The idea of form as process is an interesting counterpoint to how humans have usually constructed objects. We typically take a very top-down approach to design. We might create by sort of directly specifying volumes, measurements, and shapes, somewhat determining the essence of the final outcome right at the beginning. Computers are often touted as offering all these new ways of making stuff, but we find that design software often tries to just reproduce methods by which we made things before computers. So we have software that gives the experience of drafting, sculpting, or painting, and they translate how we've traditionally worked with physical materials into a kind of strange digital analog of those experiences. Generative design tries to propose a different direction. Can we take inspiration from how nature creates designs and focus on developing interactive processes that we can engage with? So instead of creating static objects, we could instead create dynamic systems. Instead of drawing structures, we try to grow them. So I'm going to go through a couple of projects that we did in my studio. The first one is sort of going to deal with this idea of growing structures and what does that mean. So we're going to take a brief look at biology and how systems in nature create form. This project is called Flora Form. So one question you might come up when you're thinking about organisms in nature is how do we go from a single cell to a sort of complex differentiated structure like a plant or a human being? If a single cell were just to grow and divide uniformly, you would actually just end up with a formless blob. However, through some sort of very carefully coordinated subdivision and differentiation, biological systems are able to produce structures that have specific forms and functions. In my studio, we've started calling this differential growth, and it's a really simple idea, actually. Some forms grow more than others. Some parts of a structure grow more than others, and that leads to differentiated structures. But how is that growth controlled? One example that you see all the time outside or in your window is plant tropisms. So a plant can redirect its growth towards a light source, for instance, by elongating differentially across the stem. So it's a way of translating an environmental signal that has a gradient like light into a changing amount of growth that leads to a specific differential form, bending towards light, creates curvature. You can apply the same idea to two layers of cells. If you have two layers of cells and one layer is growing faster than the other, that gives you a concave or convex shape. Sort of very simple difference in growth rate yields basic shapes that we might appreciate. This project sort of got started for me when I read a paper by a professor at Harvard named Mahadevan. He published a paper that said that you could explain how flowers bloom and how leaves ruffle by a very simple procedure. If something just grows faster at its edge, it yields these complex ruffled forms, which is kind of amazing. These shapes have a lot of different curvature to them, and they can all be explained just by a very simple rule, just grow faster at the edge. His model is pretty fascinating to me just because of its simplicity. So after reading this paper, I started just seeing this phenomena all over the place. You're walking outside, you see it on flowers, see it on succulent leaves, see it on kale leaves on your lettuce plate. They all have the sort of shapes you could describe as being generated by growing faster at the edge. Not just in plants though, sort of all strains of life, the arms of jellyfish, an anemone, certain types of fungus, cactuses, bryozoans, corals, all of them have shapes which, although they have totally different biology and totally different genetics, appear to be generated by a simple growth procedure, grow faster at the edge. Quick diversion, my favorite example of this is this guy. Have any of you ever seen these guys before? Nobody? So this is going to blow your mind. These guys are called lettuce sea slugs. You'll find them all in the Caribbean. They have this totally intricate, ornate, insane ruffle on their back, which you might think is totally impractical, like what are they doing with that? But it turns out there's a totally functional reason for that ruffle. They have a really weird behavior called kleptoplasty. They eat algae, and instead of just digesting the algae, they rip out the chloroplast. That's the part that can translate light into sugar. And they just fill their back with chloroplasts, and they become like a mobile solar farm. So the more ruffle they grow, the more chloroplasts they can harvest and stick in their back, and the more energy they can produce, which is really cool and totally just a divergence. But since none of you had ever heard of them before, I figured now was the chance to tell you so you're aware. Another example of this sort of insane hyperbolic curvy growth happens in a flower called coxcomb, which you might commonly see at the florist as the thing on the right. It's a really ruffly shape. Actually, it's supposed to look like the plant on the left. It's supposed to look like this bushy Christmas tree thing. And there's a mutation that sometimes happens which causes it to grow like the shape on the right. So when I heard about this plant, I started to get really interested in sort of what happens in the space in between these two growth forms. Like this is one plant, sometimes it grows one way, sometimes it grows another way when there's a mutation. So there's some powerful growth algorithm that we could develop which would explain both of these forms and map out sort of the entire space in between them. Which might sound very esoteric, but this is how I got started on working on this project and developing a system to explore these sorts of growths. Well, now I really skipped ahead here. So I wanted to build a computational model that would let me explore this realm of growth forms. I'd read a paper, it was very abstract, they didn't have any computational implementation. I wanted to make a system that would let me do that. So I started to build that digitally. And for me, I haven't made this explicit, but that means writing code. Everything you'll see in my presentation was generated by code that I wrote either in C++ or JavaScript. So when I'm working, it typically doesn't look like these cool animations. It just looks like a bunch of text on my screen, but eventually we get here. So this thing, can I make this play again? No, I can't make this play again. Oh, now we're stuck. So this thing that we're stuck looking at forever, can we go back now? Okay, so this thing is what happens in my simulation when I just grow uniformly, all growing at the same speed everywhere. It doesn't just get bigger, it actually makes this wrinkly, ruffly blob. And this is sort of like what happens with cancer. You have cells that are growing out of control, and the result is not business as usual. The result is this uncontrolled mess of cells. In the simulation, I sort of try to establish baselines of growth modes. So these are all hemispheres that are growing at different rates in different places. The first one is growing fastest in the red area, same here, except for the red area is allowed to split, which creates branching forms. And the third scenario is the one I'm describing where you're growing fastest at the edge, and it produces these sort of ruffling, brain-like forms. So this is sort of what happens when I first begin creating a system. I have some theory, I have some implementation I build, and then I reach this stage where it basically works. and I'm testing base scenarios. But the big question is sort of, well, first off, how do you build that? So what's happening underneath the animation you just saw is that we have a sort of spring-based surface that's represented as a mesh, and we're able to make it grow at different rates in different areas, which is encoded by the color in all of the animations I'll show you. And then we have kind of basic collision detection that's done by these spheres, so the thing doesn't intersect itself and has basic sort of physical properties. After I sort of constructed the system and have these baseline models of growth, can really start exploring how it behaves and try to manipulate the material and environmental conditions to really create a system that we can control and sculpt. I kind of like to describe our practice as a form of digital gardening, but instead of cultivating plants, we're cultivating algorithms. And ultimately, we want to craft systems that have their own kind of innate behaviors, but that we can also really interact with and manipulate. So as we're developing our software, we encode all sorts of influencers, gradients, manipulators, et cetera, that allow us to have control over what it's doing, to guide it. But what interests us in playing with systems like this isn't just that we're totally controlling, but that there's this interplay between what it does innately, sort of its material properties, and our manipulations of that. Some of these are very simple things, like changing the stiffness of the material, and others are more complex relationships that change through time. This one is pretty cool. It's just changing the different zones of growth, and it yields these forms that have different symmetry. We're changing the scale as the thing is growing to yield a sort of fractal condition. All of these digital experiments ultimately become translated into some sort of physical objects. So the first things that we did were actually just a series of sculptures that were made using selective laser sintering. The bottom one is sort of combining the first system I showed you, the leaf venation system, with the floriform system. Also did some experiments that are a type of spin on 19th century zoetropes, where we create sort of physically animated sculptures where the colors represent the rates of growth for that generated these structures, and those are printed right on the models. However, my studio mostly revolves around and is known for just making sort of everyday objects. So at Nervous System, we do a lot of weird esoteric research, and then how we disseminate those ideas and experiments is through affordable objects. So most of the money that we make is actually just from selling things like jewelry or lampshades that are generated by the systems that we create. So for this collection, we created a series of specific growth algorithms, each which yields a specific piece of jewelry. Those pieces are then sort of materialized as jewelry pieces using selective laser sintering, which produces nylon jewelry, or 3D printed in wax and then cast using the traditional wax casting method in sterling silver. We feel pretty strongly that ideas about nature and computation shouldn't be limited to academia, research, or really theoretical projects, but should start to diffuse into our daily lives, and that we can take everyday products like jewelry and have them embody really complex ideas. Okay, I'm going to talk about a completely different project that's on like opposite side of the spectrum of what we work on, called kinematics, which is a little bit about how to fuse fashion, software, and 3D printing together to examine how digital fabrication can really impact the way that we create clothing. So how can we leverage these tools not just for sort of aesthetic exploration, but instead to allow for more customization and personalization of everyday objects. Since my studio works primarily in software, we think a lot about how to open those tools up to the public, so we're not just creating tools for ourselves, but creating applications that can be shared to allow anybody to create things. This project came from thinking about textiles and how 3D printers could be used to create different types of textiles. This might sound a little bit weird at first, but textiles are actually like human creations. They're like these materials which have been transformed to have different behaviors based on how matter is arranged in space. So you might have a material like wool or cotton, but when we arrange that into something that's a weave or a knit, that really changes its behavior. They're kind of a meta material where their behavior comes from how we have chosen to arrange those fibers in space. So 3D printers then are like a different way to arrange material in space, where we can start to create more variable, strange arrangements. What sort of textiles could we create with that tool? Computation also has a really long influence on textiles, or history in textiles. The jacquard loom, which was first demonstrated in 1801, I think. A lot of people sort of think about it as the first computer almost, because it was the first machine that was made to do things with punch cards. They would weave these extremely intricate, richly illustrated fabrics by encoding the information of the design onto punch cards. I think it's interesting then that textiles have this weird property. They're not only like man-created materials, but they're also sort of historically computationally mediated. For us, we sort of took the simplest idea that we had first and then tried to build a whole system of textiles on top of that. So the idea we had was, well, what if we make a hinged textile? 3D printers generally work with hard, rigid materials, but by structuring our design as interlocking triangles, we can create things that start to behave more like a fabric. We wanted to create, in general, a textile that had material properties that could vary through space. So can we change its rigidity, its porosity, its drape, and its shape through space? We started to play with this idea very small, making small-scale pieces like necklaces or bracelets, and we're really interested in the way they moved, because they had a kind of strange hybrid behavior. They're not hard and they're not soft, they're somewhere in between. And sort of after creating these small pieces, I immediately started to want to create something bigger. Like I started imagining what would it be like to wear a long dress that's made out of this hybrid stuff that's hard and soft, but how could we do that? Lots of projects in the realm of digital fabrication take a really big thing, like let's say a building, and then they chop them up into lots of small unique pieces, which then have to be hand assembled and arranged into the final configuration. This sort of hand assembly of the project often ends up being the most complicated part. It takes more time than it did to generate the design, so you sort of have to take computation and made your life harder. We were sort of thinking about, though, could we take advantage of the fact that our design is flexible and use that to find a way to compress our garment into a smaller bounding box that could then be printed all as one piece. So what if we can take advantage of the sort of innate flexibility and combine that with the simulation to reduce its size, which sort of got us excited. It seemed like a cool idea. And then it got us thinking all these different ways, because if you can make a sort of garment fully in 3D, that kind of changes the way you think about making clothing. After all, bodies are three-dimensional. They're curvy, weird shapes, but clothing is normally made totally in flat land. We have flat material, fabric, and we have flat patterns, which are then sort of painstakingly sewn together into three-dimensional clothing. But if you can make a garment totally in 3D, then you could start from a body scan, you could design in 3D, and you could make a garment that nothing ever has to be cut, sewn, or assembled. It just emerges fully formed. So this was a cool idea, but in order to actually implement this, there were a lot of different problems we had to address and a lot of different aspects of the project that had to come together to make it work. So problems with materials in 3D printing, problems with creating the software to make this possible, problems with how do you 3D scan and fit things to bodies, and problems with the actual simulation that makes the whole thing work. We sort of started at the micro level of the garment. So the garment is ultimately a dress, but really at the beginning all we were doing was designing 3D printable hinges. Sort of a little bit tricky situation where we want to make the hinges tiny as possible so the garment can have a lot of flow and movement, but if we make it too small it will fuse together. We're really working kind of just above the tolerance that selective laser sintering allows. So at the beginning we just designed, prototyped, and physically tested sort of hundreds of different hinge mechanisms to find them one that we'd be able to build up on top of. Going from there, we then decided we would test a small thing. So we designed a necklace, and we crumpled it up in our simulation, and we printed it, and that worked. So we scaled up, and I 3D scanned myself just using a Microsoft Kinect, which is actually just a game controller. And then I crumpled that up and printed it. That worked. So I scaled up again. This bodice is the first thing we made that sort of had over 1,000 unique interlocking pieces, and was printed all as one piece. And this we were really starting to figure out, like, how is it going to fit? How comfortable is it going to be? Is it going to break and fall apart? Wanted to figure all of that out before we printed a very large, costly object. And then at the same time we were doing those experiments, we started thinking about how to create a design application that would allow anybody to create these objects. All of the sort of little prototype things I just showed you were created in code that we made that had no user interface whatsoever. You would just run some code on a mesh and it would produce something, but there was no way to control it or see what the heck you were doing, which is not ideal, obviously. So we started working on this. It's called Kinematics Cloth, and it's another web application you can use on our website. It's just built in JavaScript and WebGL, and hypothetically allows you to create garments either from 3D scans of your body or from measurements of your body. So sort of the key idea behind this is that you're always working in 3D, so it's never decomposed into flat views, and you can paint and draw directly on the body, changing the silhouette and the sort of styling. You add different tops, you can change the hemline, etc. You can add different styles of perforated pattern, and you can change the underlying sort of tessellation of the garment, so you can make it more rigid or more drapey. And all of this is sort of done in real time. Another set of problems, as I mentioned, was 3D scanning. How do we actually create garments that are going to fit people? While 3D printers, well, not 3D printers, 3D scanners are increasingly available in the form of like game controllers and apps for your iPhone, these things are very glitchy and noisy. So that's somewhat of a problem because we actually need a really high quality scan, so we're able to tell things like, where's your neckline? Which part is your armpit? Are you slouching or are you standing up straight? That's all sort of contextual information that isn't captured, even if the scan was perfect. So we got really lucky in that we found a collaborator who happened to be working exactly on this project, on this problem called Body Labs, who had created a kind of parametric body model based on machine learning from thousands of scans from different people. So their system sort of works by you provide them with either measurements or scan data, and then they refit that data onto a perfect parametric body and adapt that mesh. So that gave us a way to sort of always be designing on a clean mesh that was the same between different people, and allows us to map any garments designed for one person onto another person's body in a very sort of logical, correct way. The last part of the project is the simulation. So how do we actually take these garments, which are composed of 3,000 to 6,000 unique interlocking rigid bodies, and fold them down into something small enough to fit in a 3D printer? While we initially conceived of just taking a garment and sort of wadding it up to barely fit it in the printer, that turns out not to be the most efficient way to pack clothes into a 3D printer. Sort of like when you put things in your dresser, you don't just wad them up, you sort of fold them in a logical way and then they fit in quite well. That ended up being really the best strategy for us as well. As we developed this software, we can do sort of sequential folds of the garments and then reduce them down to sort of over 85% of their original volume for printing. So we can take the simulation and we can use it for really practical stuff like making things more compact and fitting them in a 3D printer, but we can also use it for things that help us design better. So these garments are made out of all of these strange hinged pieces of different sizes. It's really hard to understand how they're going to move and flow. So we can use the simulation as a sort of feedback loop while we're designing each garment, look at how it's going to drape and move, and then use that to impact how we're designing it before we actually print anything. So we did sort of all of this work, and we actually never made any garments. It was just a conceptual project, and we had this cool video. But then I got an email from a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, Paula Antonelli, and she had seen the concept video and was interested in potentially acquiring a dress for their permanent collection, which, you know, as a young designer getting an email from the curator at the moment being like, I want to acquire this, like a huge deal, but I don't know if she actually knew that we'd never made a garment, like ever, and that we weren't sure it was going to work. So this video was filmed at Shapeways 3D printing factory in New York the day before they actually needed it at this MoMA meeting that only happens 2 times a year. And we were just like watching it come out, and it was super stiff, and we weren't sure like if it was working at all or if we'd messed something up. And there's all this powder in there that has to be shook out. So the way the process works is by using a laser to fuse together some, but not all the powder. So at this point, we're just super nervous that spent all this time working on it, and it was going to be like a total failure. But luckily, we were able to shape out a lot of the powder on this vibration table, and then I called my friend, and she came down and tried it on. And this was probably one of the most sort of satisfying moments of my life, seeing that this idea like actually worked after spending like more than a year just like thinking about it and prototyping it and testing it. So yes, good moment. So this dress then is the first one we made, and it's a kind of intricately patterned structure that has more than 2,200 unique panels that are interconnected by more than 3,300 hinges, and they're all 3D printed as one piece in nylon. While each component is totally rigid, they sort of in aggregate start to behave like a continuous fabric that allows the dress to flexibly conform and flow in response to body movement. Unlike traditional fabric, the textile is very non-uniform, It varies in rigidity, drape, flex, and porosity through space. But really the thing we're most excited about is that the entire piece is customizable. So starting from a 3D scan of your body, you can completely change the design, the shape, the fit, the whole thing. And then there's some more slides here that I forgot I put here. We made more dresses. They look different. This one has scales on it, but it's basically the same deal. Okay, so completely different project now, jigsaw puzzles. I often don't talk about the jigsaw puzzles project because people are like, you make jigsaw puzzles, that's so weird. Tell me more about the robotically fabricated dresses. But jigsaw puzzles turn out to be an exceedingly large part of our business in the past couple of years. So I feel like it makes sense to talk about. So this project is a little bit more about thinking about how to sort of take traditional craft practices and sort of reinterpret them through digital fabrication. Most people know about cardboard jigsaw puzzles. They're these mass-produced, cheap cardboard toys that are made with a die cut of metal that punches cardboards, and they feature very simple, repetitive forms which assemble to make a picture of like kittens or a national park or something. However, puzzles actually have a long history. They first came about around the 1800s. They were cut by hand from wood. They were not actually cut with a jigsaw. That's a misnomer. They were cut with a scroll saw right around the invention of the scroll saw. And every one was one of a kind because they were made by people who were cutting them by hand. So necessarily they were all going to be different. But because wood and hand cutting allowed for considerably more freedom, you had interesting developments of people had very different piece styles. Some people might cut things more squiggly, or some people might cut things more sort of rectangular. And there were all sorts of special pieces embedded in the puzzle, like unique figures that you might recognize. So we wandered upon like a store in Paris called Puzzles Michelle Wilson, where they still hand cut wood puzzles. And we're just kind of blown away by how intricate and beautiful these pieces were. We started just thinking about like, well, we have some laser cutters in our studio. We could use these to make wood puzzles, but what would sort of be the interesting, unique thing that we would do with a wood puzzle? Around the same time, I also got this fossil of an ammonite. Ammonites are relatives of cephalopods that lived around 110 million years ago. So they're like related to octopuses. And on the ammonite shell, there are these really cool patterns called suture patterns, which were actually the walls in between each successive chamber of the shell. As they would grow, they'd add on a chamber. And for some reason, the walls were shaped like this. Scientists argue about this a lot. Why are they shaped like that? And they're never going to find out because they've been dead for over 110 million years. So there's not really an answer. But I was looking at this and thought, wow, these would be amazing puzzle pieces. These are really weird interlocking shapes. So it sort of took me down a series of reading scientific articles and talking to people about how would you simulate or grow shapes that look like this. The first thing I actually thought of is this really fun experiment that I encourage everybody to do. You just need 2 pieces of glass and some glycerin or other viscous fluid and water. It's called a Helle-Shaw cell, and it's an experiment where you inject a low viscosity fluid into a high viscosity fluid, and it naturally forms these extremely intricate branching patterns. So I looked into how to simulate this a little bit. Turns out to be extremely computationally slow. Like if you were trying to grow a puzzle like this, it would take multiple days. So that didn't pan out. Then I started reading some papers about Laplacian growth in general, which is basically growth processes that are driven by diffusion, like diffusion of electricity is lightning, or diffusion of pressure is what we just saw is those Helle-Shaw cells. I was reading about diffusion of temperature, which is called dendritic solidification, and leads to weird crystals that look like this. So what we came up with is essentially a way to grow jigsaw puzzles where we start with a bunch of points randomly distributed, and then we grow each piece into each other piece. Which sounds kind of simple at first, but when you think about it, like in nature, you would grow like a solid into a liquid, like an ice crystal into liquid water. But if you want to grow all of these different pieces next to each other, you sort of need just as many phases of matter as you have pieces. So in the simulation to make these puzzles, we created a system where you have sort of infinite phases of matter that grow into each other, which is pretty weird, and just an example of the sort of things you can do in the computer that are inspired by real life but would never make sense in actual reality if you were to physically implement them. So we ended up creating these puzzles called the radial puzzles, which feature art by a friend of ours named Jonathan McCabe, who's an incredible computational artist. Every single puzzle is unique, it has a different set of pieces and a different image, and they're lasercut at our studio in Boston. These puzzles sort of started to get at what we liked about traditional wood puzzles, but like our own spin on that. More recently, we made a new series of puzzles that are inspired by slices of agate. So these ones have a slightly different cut styles. You'll see these more squiggly pieces. And every one has a different shape in addition to a different image and a different series of pieces. The images are kind of grown from an initial seed and then grow kind of layer by varying the kind of conditions that they're growing with. They yield these unique bands of color and unique shapes. The cut style for these pieces, there we have the image generation, slightly behind here. The cut style for these pieces is based on a simulation of lengthening elastic rods. So we have a bunch of pieces that are just essentially rods, and they grow and lengthen, and as they lengthen, they sort of push each other and intertwine to make these very intricate puzzle piece shapes. Now that's all well and good. These are still kind of normal puzzles, whatever. But we started to think about what you can do with simulation that you couldn't ever do by hand, like what would be impossible to do as a person. So one thing you can't do as a person is if you cut two pieces apart with the saw blade, those are the only two things that would ever go together. You wouldn't be able to cut a separate piece somewhere else and have it actually match up. So we started to think about making a puzzle that was extra difficult. Like what if you took away everything that makes a puzzle easy to do? No image, no edge, goes together in multiple ways. And then we called this the challenge puzzle. We thought, oh, we've done it. This is going to be the hardest jigsaw puzzle that you can think of. We were wrong. Then we came up with this other idea. What if we made something called the infinity puzzle? So at the challenge puzzle, like I said, we tried to get rid of everything you would start with, so there was no edge. But there still sort of was an edge, like it stopped in one place. What if you made a puzzle that was based on the topology of a torus? So one side matches up to the other side, and the bottom matches up to the top. Then you'd have a puzzle that has no fixed boundary, because it tiles, and it really has never any end. You could just keep doing it forever. So it resembles in all of these different ways, sort of unending different shapes. So that's good. That's challenging. However, there's other mathematical figures that you might think could make even more interesting puzzles. Like, what if we took the topology of a Klein bottle, where the edges match up, but they flip over? That might be an interesting puzzle. Turns out this is a really challenging puzzle, because not only do you have a puzzle that has no beginning and no end, but it actually has no top and no bottom. Pieces from one side, as you're going to see, you can pick them up, flip them over, and they seamlessly connect on the other side. Here we go. Flip. Yep. So we sort of chose an image from the Hubble telescope of the Milky Way galaxy and dubbed this the infinite galaxy puzzle. And every time you assemble it, it makes a different picture of the galaxy. We're really interested in seeing how kind of new technologies like laser cutting can allow us to create sort of new versions of traditional crafts, but do it in a way that isn't just an imitation of what traditional crafts are, but really an extension of what was great about them. I didn't put a lot in about this, but I figured it's newer work, so I just drop it in here. The past year, we've been doing a lot of work with 3D printed ceramics and also traditional ceramics. This collection that we did in collaboration with a 3D printing company, Forum Labs, is using a new ceramic resin that you can print on any SLA printer. It's sort of a hybrid process where you 3D print resin that's infused with ceramic, then you fire it in a kiln up to 2,340 degrees, burns out all of the plastic, and it leaves behind just sort of pure vitreous ceramic, which you can glaze as you choose. And then we also have been doing work sort of combining simulation with mold making for traditional ceramics, creating this cup sort of inspired by brain coral, where we're able to create a sort of multi-part slip casting mold that allows us to create very intricate, sort of totally traditional ceramics, but with hidden seam lines. So we can make a 4-part mold where there are no seam lines left after casting. So we really like to do work in our studio that combines sort of not just digital methods and not just math, but also with like hands-on working with traditional craft methods and traditional fabrication techniques. I'll just leave this part here because it's really cool. This for me is just really exciting to see it come out. So you don't know if it's going to work. There it is. It worked. Okay. Now we can move on. I have no idea where I'm at on time. 6:20. How long am I supposed to go until? As long as I want. Okay, so another project on the other end. So all the projects I showed you so far are projects that we just did in our studio that are totally self-generated. Like we came up with an idea and we implemented it, we did it for ourselves, and we monetized it as a product ourselves to pay for the project. In other scenarios, we are hired as sort of contract work for big companies. So we have a long-running collaboration with New Balance for the past 3 years, looking at sort of the future of footwear and how 3D printing and computation can be used to create new types of performance footwear. Can you use 3D printing to make shoes that perform and fit better? Towards this end, one of the projects we did early on was designing these midsoles for running shoes that are 3D printed in a TPU rubbery material. This is the only project I'm showing tonight that uses data. Most of the time our work is more focused on interactivity, but in this project we're really looking at how can you capture pressure data from midsoles that are put in running shoes to look at how different people apply pressure in different areas of their foot as they're running. I did the thing where I clicked the slide. Okay, we went. So we, early on in the project, looked at many different ways of translating this data into volumetric structures that could be 3D printed and sort of functionally used as midsoles. Sort of many different styles, some of which are more visual and some of which are more functional. The method that we ended up going with for the shoes that were released is creating variable density anisotropic foam structures. So we're very inspired by the way cellular structures in bone or wood respond to different environmental conditions during development to put more material where more material is needed due to the load. So we ended up creating these customizable midsoles. The one on the left came from data of a person who strikes on their midfoot, so they always land on the front of their foot. The one on the right was generated from data of a person who consistently lands on their heel, and that yields these different customized structures. This is really an ongoing collaboration, looking at how we can leverage 3D printing and computation to change the way we make sneakers, sort of replacing mass production with customized fabrication. This is a tool that we created for them that's intended to be sort of a prototype for a consumer-facing tool where people could load their data in the store and then produce a fully customized midsole in real time. We do a lot of work creating software for other people like this. I'm at the last slide. Okay, so hopefully you can see some threads weaving through my series of projects I showed you today, thinking about kind of new opportunities offered by digital fabrication, ways of using new technologies to engage more people in the design process, thinking about how to reinterpret traditional crafts and incorporate data to objects, and also really confusing puzzles. Think we have questions after this. I think I'm just going to stop, and then if people have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, no matter how obscure. So thanks a lot. We don't just stand in darkness. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, one brave soul.
I have a question about the sound that the dress produces. Can you talk more about that?
It does sort of produce sound. I didn't hook up anything that lets me play audio, but it sounds like a little bit like Legos, but not as loud. So it's somewhat quiet, but it does have like a type of like seashells. If you made like a wind chime out of seashells or something, it would sound like that. It's not something that we considered when designing it, but it is like something that exists, which I can describe poorly.
How much does it weigh?
I think it weighs 3 pounds. Well, it depends on which one it is. The one with the sort of scales on top of it weighs a little bit more. Sort of comparable to the weight of a wedding gown, but more than a t-shirt.
Thanks a lot. This is fascinating to me. Really appreciate you sharing your work with us. We had Liam Young here a couple years back, and he showed a bunch of stuff, mind-blowing stuff himself. And one of the points he made, they had designed a hoodie that could be worn to resist LiDAR scanning, which was really exciting to see his kind of take on that. But he made a pretty interesting comment that I want to hear your comment about his comment. That things like that would shift fashion out of like kind of seasonal mutations, if you will, kind of more of a consumerist pattern, into a stronger relationship with technology and emerging technology and different political attitudes about technology, right? So LiDAR scan, we want to hide from that, or we want to be seen by that. And I'm curious about your take here, because this is kind of not related really to what he was doing, but kind of nonetheless a fascinating pairing for me, just thinking about fashion with respect to technology and fashion with respect to kind of market formation and taste formation, et cetera.
Yeah, that's an interesting question that I don't know if I have a good answer to. I think that in general there's a kind of push not towards what he's saying, which may be valid, but towards just like slow fashion in general, so like buying fewer things that are better made. And I think sort of return to the idea of customized fashion. Like it used to be you'd go to a shoemaker and they'd make you a shoe and it would fit you. And you would use that shoe a long time because it was a high quality shoe. Now we have this sort of, supply and demand. There's like ample manufacturing to make tons of new poor quality things every month, which are then brought in. And there's like, yes, a huge like seasonal changeover of fashion. But I think that there are a lot of people out there who are doing things to return to a more like slower pace of making and consumption, which I don't know if it's in response to technology. In some ways it's like technology is always around and has always been a part of fashion and making fabrics and things. So it's just sort of an extension of maybe our cognizance of the impact on the environment of what fast fashion does. It's like a huge producer of waste and materials. Yeah, I don't really know about the whole surveillance thing. Surveillance is like here, and everything we do on our phones and computers is in every database all the time, and I don't know how to resist that, or if wearing a special hoodie is gonna make a difference or not, but maybe. I don't have the answer.
Thank you again. I was curious about the collaboration between the two of you, and whether you now both do everything, or there's still things that come from your educational experience.
My partner and I tend to be a little bit specialized. He loves math. Math is his passion. So he's definitely more centered on sort of the initial stages of development of a system and the sort of architecture of that, how it's going to work. I tend to come more in and then figure out what are we going to do to the system, developing sort of the user interface or figuring out what it's good for, and then pushing it in that direction. But I do think that as the years have gone by, we both wear each other's hats more and more often. Like now he considers himself an artist and designer, where at the beginning he didn't. And now have 10 years more experience as a computer programmer than I did at the beginning. So it goes both ways.
Do you think that maybe a new phase would be creating patterns based on human actions? So like thinking of more of like a stretchy, kind of like when you think of stretchy fabrics, almost like objects that can both expand and contract.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. I think in terms of the garment production and things that we do for unnamed shoe companies, there's a lot of thought in like looking at the function of different parts of the body and like putting different structures in areas that make sense for different types of functions. Like if it's a part that needs to be under compression versus a part that needs to flex more, putting more structures there. If you're talking more like actively, like about expressive wearables that move, I would check out the work of Behnaz Farahi. She does really cool stuff with wearable architectures that are meant to express sort of your emotions and move around. which is not what I do, but there are lots of cool people who are doing that.
Question here. Thanks for sharing your work. I can't help but think of everything from Art Nouveau to Ernst Haeckel in terms of the ways in which nature finds expression in form. My question has to do with the way you're emulating ecological models and looking at nature for generating form. And sometimes nature fails. Can you give us an example of something, because you're showing a great number of successes here, in which a system failed, as can happen within systems of nature?
I don't really have any exciting examples. I mean, the basic answer is things fail all the time. Like the systems we make, like 90% of the time they're not working, they're not doing what we intend for them to do. It takes like many years to build a stable system that is really unique and different and valuable to work with. You know, just basic things like there's all sorts of numerical errors, which is not interesting to you guys, but that happen when you're doing computational geometry, which yields towards buggy, unstable systems that explode or that self-intersect or crash your computer or whatever it is. Do I have any interesting examples, though? That's the question. I'll think about it, and maybe I'll think of something that's interesting. But basically, yes, everything fails all the time.
Given your current production ways, how large can you actually manufacturing for a project? And do you like?
Are you asking how many things do
like,
we make, or?
What's the largest object that you could probably produce?
Oh, the size of the object itself, not the quantity of
Given that it
objects.
expands.
I'm not very big at all. We don't have large machinery in my studio, since we mostly are specialized on making objects that we can afford to make and other people can afford to sell and we can ship across the country. We're pretty specialized on small scale things. We have several, like 3 laser cutters that are 20 by 32, and we have a bunch of desktop 3D printers and a CNC router. I mean, we can't make very big things with our own in-house stuff, but we have collaborated with other people to do like architectural scale projects, but not within our own things that we would fabricate in our studio. I guess we are working on a public sculpture for a park in Somerville that's going to be pretty big, but it's not going to be 3D printed. It's going to be made of flat, riveted metal panels. So it'll be made sort of in panels that are small and that are painstakingly hand-assembled into a larger piece. I don't know. I think that was your question, probably. Yes, okay. Was there another person back there at some point who didn't get to ask their question? I remember there was a hand. But now they're like, I never had my hand up. Yes.
What's on the horizon for you? Like, what's a technique or a process that you'd love to develop, but you haven't had time to yet?
We're definitely interested in doing a lot more with ceramics, both 3D printed ceramics and traditional ceramics. We're also, like I said, we're working on this large-scale sculpture project, which is much more about converting double curved surfaces into panels and reassembling them, that we're sort of doing with a new method from Keen and Crane at CMU, which is really exciting. We have one project that isn't published yet that's about 3D printing living tissues and designing sort of vascular networks, blood vessels that can be 3D printed to support that, which is really exciting. And then the other exciting thing is we're moving our studio from Boston to the Catskills, so a lot of boring moving and construction issues.
Maybe one more.
Thank you for coming. That was really exciting. You're very entrepreneurial in the projects that you've shown, and it sounds like the studio was founded pretty soon after you graduated. Maybe maybe that's not correct, but is that something that you had to develop, or like, is there something that we as students could grab onto to be very proactive and innovative in our ideas?
So yeah, we started the studio when we were still both in school. So there's we're working on it over the January period at MIT, which is we don't have any class then. And we weren't really doing it to be entrepreneurial. We're mostly just doing it because I was doing this sort of computational generative work in architecture school, and none of my studio professors appreciated what I was doing in any way. It was like I was doing terribly, and everybody was like, computation should not be used for this. This is no good. So it was sort of like an outlet for taking the things I was doing and translating them into something that people actually did appreciate, which turned out to be jewelry. And it just kind of took off, and people started writing about it. Part of it because it was a good story, like MIT-trained biologist makes laser-cut jewelry. So part of it is just like have a project you can actually pull off on your own. Like you don't need investor money to do it, and it's small scale enough that you can make it a reality, and it's good to have a good story so people can get excited about your work and understand it. But yeah, I think we just kind of got lucky. We were doing the right thing at the right time when these technologies were just starting to pique people's attention, and partially we just got really lucky that people were interested in our work, and we were able to sort of be self-funded, do work, make money, take that money, make more work, on and on.